Hello, I'm Stan Stolniker. We're at the Hub Culture Climate Campus in Belém at COP30, continuing our conversations, negotiations, and strategy work on all things climate. Joining me now for a special episode of the Hub Culture Chronicles, our ongoing podcast, is Binka Le Breton. She is an activist and an author, and the author of a book called The Greatest Gift. We're going to be diving into the story of that book today and also talking about a really important issue that has emerged at COP30, which is around the rule of law and essentially security inside the Amazon region. Over the last 20 years, there has been a growing issue around security for both indigenous communities and activists working to help save the Amazon. And from the conversations we've had this week here in Belém, it has become a bigger and bigger issue because the way that activists and people who are working to protect the Amazon are being affected is changing. There's the issue of physical security and violence, and there's also the issue of what we might think of as economic security and economic violence. So, Binka, thank you for joining us. I'm so pleased to have you here. We met on the Voice of the Oceans boat with our partners next door for a wonderful tour of the work that they're doing. But tell us about you and this book, The Greatest Gift.
Stan, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for inviting me. It was really a fortunate meeting, right?
For sure.
Well, my name is Binka, and I live in Brazil. I may sound like I come from England, because I do, but I've been in Brazil for a while. And I run the Rainforest Restoration Organization, and that's what got me interested in the whole question of rainforest, the Atlantic forest where I work, and the Amazon forest. And when I first arrived, it was like a change of life for me. We had been living in Washington, D.C. before that. I was actually a concert pianist, so I was traveling the world doing music. My husband was in the World Bank, so we were living in different countries. And we had this idea that we'd like to find out if sustainability was really real. And to do that, we needed to stay in a place long enough to see a change. Because in the international development world, you're parachuting into a country with a solution, and you don't always stay long enough to see if it works or not. So that's the background. And when I got here, I found I couldn't really be a concert pianist in the middle of the rainforest. I do have a piano, but I don't have much of an audience. And
You have the birds.
So I have the birds. So I was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. I was in my 40s, and somebody said to me, "Why don't you write? Because any fool can write." Well, maybe any fool can write, but any fool can't publish, let me let you know. So anyway, my first book was, I looked out of the window, I saw the forest, and I thought, I must go to the Amazon and find out what Amazon people think about the future of the Amazon, because everybody has very grandiose ideas about what should be done. But at that time, nobody had really thought to ask the people, so I spent many months traveling in the interior of the Amazon and talking to all sorts of people. And that gave rise to my first book, which was called Voices of the Amazon, as opposed to Voices of the Ocean, where you and I met the other day. And then from there, I became interested in the Amazon people and what they have to say about the future of the Amazon, what their vision is, as much as an outsider is able to understand that and to convey it to other people. And then the whole question of land rights, which is a very hot topic, which we'll be getting into, and the violence in the Amazon. Why is such a beautiful place that is so important to the whole world the center of so much violent crime? And then I wrote a book about, in the outer Amazon area, in the state of Tocantins, about a Brazilian priest who was murdered in the course of the land struggles. And then I became very interested in that, and I looked at the question of modern day slavery.
And who was that priest?
It was called Padre Josimo. It was about the time of Chico Mendes. But Chico Mendes had contacts with international people, so his story was able to get out. Padre Josimo did not have any of that, so really nobody knew. But in the case of Padre Josimo, and later in the case of Dorothy that we'll be talking about, it was the chronicle of a death foretold, right? And this is a Latin thing. If a person, an activist, comes up against, politicians or people with different agendas, that person can be scheduled to die. And maybe that person is the last person to find out. But if I know that you are on the death list, I'm probably not going to hang out with you. And you may not understand that for a bit. And so when you see Padre Josimo, you could see the moment that he was marked to die because he was getting in the way. He was supporting the little people against the powerful people. And it's the same thing with Dorothy Stang. And that's why I wrote the book. And it's really all about environmental violence and personal violence. And I think that's what we're here at COP to try and find solutions for.
And to understand, and I do think that there's this concept of saying someone's name, which is very important. That's why I wanted you to say the name of the priest, because we have to remember these people and the sacrifice that they have made, whether they meant to or not,
Right.
And the impact that that has over time, so that these people can be remembered and they can be not dying in vain. And so, tell me about The Greatest Gift, the book that you wrote about Dorothy Stang. Who was Dorothy Stang?
The sort of genesis of the book, I had written about Padre Josimo, I had written about slave labor in the Amazon, and I was traveling in the States, and Dorothy Stang was murdered. And she's an American nun, so that was news in the States. But several of my friends thought that this foreign woman who was active in the Amazon who had been murdered was me. Well, I was there, so I knew it wasn't me, and my husband luckily knew it wasn't me, but that's when I decided to find out her story.
Thankfully for this podcast, it wasn't you.
Right. So I thought it would be very interesting to find out more about her, why she went to the Amazon, what she did, why she died, because I think I wanted to know, what difference does a life make? If you lose your life for something like that, does it really change anything? And I discovered that it does.
Okay.
So,
let's hear her story.
So Dorothy was a sort of middle-class American lady born in the 1930s, right? Large old Catholic family in Ohio. She went to school with, the school was run by members of her order, the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. And she loved them. She thought they were doing wonderful things and changing the world. And remembering that she was young, but during the 30s and then the time of the war, and she passionately wanted to do something to make the world a better place. So at the age of 17, she joined the convent, which was the youngest that would accept her, much against the wishes of her father, who was a military man and very upright, and thought she was wasting her time and she should get married and have children like everybody else. So she goes off and she joins the convent, and in those days, this is just at the end of the war, she has to wear a habit and take vows of poverty, and it's an extraordinarily different life. But she does it because she loves the nuns and she thinks that that's the way she's going to be able to change the world. So she starts out there, and they're a teaching order, as many nuns are, and so she studies teaching, and she goes off to New Mexico, and there she comes across poverty for the first time, because she's working in the Native American reservations and with the braceros who've come up from Mexico. And they are dying because people are spraying pesticides on them as they work in the fields. And so she becomes very active. And at this time, the same time, is the beginning of the theology of liberation. So the church on the side of the poor, because the Catholic Church had traditionally been on the side of the government and the status quo.
The rich.
And the rich, exactly. So at that time, the Pope issues a call for people to go and work in South America. And Dorothy puts her name down, and they turn her down. And they say, no, you're doing a good job where you are. Just stay where you are. So she doesn't actually get to follow her dream until 1966, when she's already 30, early 30s. And she arrives in Rio. It's the beginning of the dictatorship. And she arrives a little nun, you know, in a habit with some others. And it's very hot. And she finds that the Brazilian members of the church are wearing jeans and T-shirts. Now, if you've been for 10 years a nun wearing a habit, it's kind of a protection for you. It gives you status, right? And so when they decided, encouraged by their Brazilian peers, to cast off the habit and start to dress like everybody else, they're giving away this protection, and they're becoming automatically on the side of the poor. And the sort of motto of their order is to work with the poorest of the poor in the most abandoned places. So that's what she's doing. And she gets sent up from Rio. She meets Leonardo Boff and some of the great liberation theologians down in Rio. And she gets sent up to Maranhão to work there. And at first it's sort of social justice and a decent life for the poor, because it's a place of tremendous inequalities still today, and even more so then. And when she's there, she begins to realize that the Brazilian government is sending whole groups of people into the Amazon, ocupar para não entregar, to occupy it so we don't give it away. And very, very poor, landless people mostly, from the northeast or from the deep south near Argentina. And telling these people, come to the Amazon and you can have land and live happily. And it's a horrible shock for them. Because if you come from Rio Grande do Sul, you expect to find a piece of farmland, and when you come here to the Amazon, they are abandoned in the middle of the forest. And this was happening so much that Dorothy decided that she needed to go further into the Amazon forest to support these people.
Okay. So she's going deeper into the jungle.
Yes.
With her life and her path.
Yes. And
this is now what year?
Yeah, well, we're now 1970s. And there's a little guerrilla thing going on in the south of Pará, near Marabá, called the Araguaia Rebellion. And it's a group of young idealists from São Paulo who want to go and work in the forest and help the local people, many of whom are settlers from other parts, and some of whom are indigenous. And there's a very heavy military presence there.
And is there a kind of inherent conflict between these settlers and the indigenous?
Yes. That is the root of the problem, because the settlers thought that they had no idea what to expect. They didn't expect to find trees everywhere, and they didn't expect to bump into the indigenous, and neither did the indigenous expect to bump into them. So that was immediately a cause of conflict. And the military came in to try and resolve it. And it became increasingly dangerous for anyone who was working on behalf of the people to carry on. So eventually Dorothy was told she needed to leave that area, otherwise something would happen to her. So in 1982, she's been in that hot area for some time with a lot going on. She moves into the Xingu to Altamira, which is way down 500 kilometers from here on the Trans-Amazon Highway, and an area of even more conflict. And she goes, remember she's a nun, so she has to answer to the bishop and to the church. Some of her colleagues, her other sisters, think it's very dangerous. And she's not only endangering herself, but she's endangering them and the reputation of the church, because some of them were quite conservative and, traditional kind of nuns. And she goes to meet the bishop. And the bishop says, you have no idea what you're getting into. This place is so poor. The people when they die, they've got no place to lay their bones. This is the poorest of the poor. And she said, this is where I'm coming. And she set off.
Fascinating. have this mental picture of her journey.
She had a little motorbike, one of those little Italian sort of motorbike, push bike kind of things. And she went off, and when she first arrived, because she was a foreigner and looked different from the rest, everybody ran away. They thought she was from the government come to take their land. So she would go out, on the back terrible roads on her little motorbike, which often broke down, and she'd have to stop and push it or spend the night, in wherever she could find a place to sleep. But gradually people came to realize that she was okay, and she was there to help them. And she started to make friends, and she started with the women who were mostly in the little settlers' houses while the guys were out there trying to make a living on the land. And Dorothy began to create a little community of these people who came from different parts of the country and were all desperately trying to make a living. And she said, we can do it, but we have to work with the forest and not against it. So we've got to figure out ways that we can live in the forest without destroying it. And that was where she started a whole kind of movement that was in existence, but she was very instrumental in kind of pushing it forward, because she had this determination and this passionate desire to save the world. And so she started.
And so she began working with these communities, helping them to organize and helping them to think about the forest.
Yes.
We always have heard that the indigenous are the best stewards,
Right.
but maybe the settlers weren't the best stewards.
Right. The settlers knew how to farm in temperate lands, or the ones that came from the northeast lived in very dry lands and probably didn't have much experience. So for them it was a completely different setup. And she was determined to get this sort of mixed group of people all together to see if between them they could figure out what to do. She was never a white savior. She didn't come and say, here, I know what to do. She was figuring it out with them as they went along. And so she started by helping them build a slightly better house, getting the kids together and starting a little school. Because she had an education, she could go and speak to the people in the towns and say, listen, these people need access to the land. We need access to health. We need access to education. And so she became the spokesperson for these scattered, very impoverished settlers. And she also became known amongst the local indigenous and the quilombolas, the groups of originally escaped slaves. So there are all kinds of people all trying to make a living, but at the same time, there were the big guys who came to take the trees, to do illegal gold mining, and with a culture of violence that is, dominating the land and extracting the natural resources and keeping them for themselves. So it would seem that they were very unevenly matched. And the people had Dorothy on their side. And so Dorothy began slowly to attract a reputation of being a damned nuisance. Yeah.
So she is helping these groups, and she starts to get the reputation of being a nuisance.
Yes.
And I suppose at some point she ends up on one of these lists.
Right. What she does, she has on her side some of her fellow workers in the church, some of the settlers not, because they would rather work for the rich landowners or for the loggers. And so she's sort of polarizing, in a sense, the community there. But it's not just a question of social justice. As she goes along and as she sees the forest falling, she used to wear a T-shirt, and it said, "The death of the forest is the death of us all." So she was ahead of her time, right? This is in the 80s and 90s, right? And then at some point, people began to put her name out as a nuisance, and she needed to leave.
Causing problems.
Causing problems. And I think at this point, we've almost got to the 90s now, she begins to burn out because conditions are really bad. She lives in the forest, she gets malaria, lots of times, she gets dengue fever. She lives very simply, she stays in their houses, she's getting a little bit older, she's getting to her 50s and 60s. And so the nuns in America pull her back and say, you need to come out and have a break. And she goes back, and she goes to California, and she comes across a theology of creation and seeing the forest as Mother Nature in the sort of indigenous way, right? And I think before that she'd been thinking of more of social justice and more of a fair deal for the settlers. And that 6 months she had time to reflect and to see that in order for the people to live well, they had to work with the forest and not against it. So she comes back, she goes to Rio, Eco 92 in Rio, so the United States, the United Nations meeting there. And she comes back and her focus has switched.
The first Rio Earth Summit?
That's the first Rio Earth Summit.
That was in 1992, I think.
1992. And so that's really the beginning of the environmental movement in Brazil, in fact. It didn't really exist before that. So she's riding the wave, right? And as she wants to defend the forest as well as the forest people, she's becoming more and more a target for the other side.
And who is the other side?
There are loggers, illegal loggers. The basic situation is that who does the land belong to, right? And ever since the beginning, the settlement of when the Portuguese arrived, there have been different layers of land tenure. So it was done by the capitanias, by the state. So the Portuguese, if you were a friend of mine, I'll give you an area as far as your eye can see, just as they did in America, yeah, in Virginia. And then, different land titles were layered on top of one another. So nobody really knew who the land belonged, but most of it belonged to the state. And the land grabbers would go in and they would just appropriate an area, put their security people in there, and then start to take out the trees.
And at the same time, dislocating the people who were indigenous to that land.
Yes. Or who happened to be settlers there, or quilombolas, whoever was there. Because of the Amazon, when the government sent people in, they gave the impression that nobody was living there. Actually, 20 million people were living there. And so just sending people in and appropriating the land caused a lot of conflict. And that still happens today. It's still one of the most important problems of the Amazon. The question of the land, the question of the resources. And today you see the presence of organized crime, right? Cocaine, arms, people smuggling.
Okay, we're going to get into that in a moment.
Yeah.
So the Rio Earth Summit happens in 1992.
Yeah.
She comes to the Rio Earth Summit.
Yes.
And then?
And comes back all excited. It's like being at a COP, right? And she comes up with the idea of creating a sustainable settlement project, right? And she manages to persuade the local authorities to create the idea of a sustainable settlement, because there already were settlements given by the government. And so what she's doing now is she's fighting to let people have tenure and papers to the land on which they're working, and to work with it on the sort of setup of that was that you could have 20-hectare plot, but you had to protect the forest. So you planted things that grow in the forest instead of cutting the forest down. And this was going back to the indigenous way of managing the forest. And people got very excited about it. And at the time, we've now got into the 2000s, and things are getting very, very hot and conflictive, you know. She manages to get papers for a large area with quite a lot of people in it on these 20-hectare farms. And she's going back and telling the people that the land is now yours, you're safe, nobody can come and throw you off it, it belongs to you. And it's at that point that she comes to Beleng regularly on a bus, sometimes takes 2 or 3 days because it's not a paved road at the time, right? And she gets the papers and she takes them back to the people and she says, this land is ours, we've won the battle. And it is on that visit into the interior that she is murdered.
And this is the focal point of The Greatest Gift.
Yes. What is a life worth, right? And Dorothy, what intrigued me about it was, did she know? Did she think that God would save her? What did she think? There's a group of nuns of that order here in Beleng, and she used to stay with them when she came off these long, grueling bus journeys, you know, going around various government bodies here in Beleng. And just before she went back for the last time, she was in her room in this very simple little house, and she's sitting there late in the evening. She's going to travel next morning, and she's just slumped over in despair. And one of the other sisters comes in and says, what's happening? And she says, they're going to kill me. I know they're going to kill me. And the sister says, no, why don't you stay here it's carnival next week. Stay with us and let's enjoy carnival. Nothing's going to happen. And she said, no, we don't have carnival in the forest. This is our Christmas and Easter because we've got the title to the land and I'm going. And she pulled herself together and she said, nobody's going to have the courage to kill an old lady like me. And off she goes. And she takes with her a younger sister who is a real townie and is horrified by going into the forest with spiders and, you know, indigenous people and malaria. And they travel out to the area that has now been given to them for the Sustainable Development Project. And there is one of the loggers on their land. And she goes up to him and she says, stop cutting the trees because this is our land. And he said, if you don't get out of my way, I can't tell you what's going to happen to you. And the other people who are with her say, this isn't safe. We have to withdraw. So she goes and she's, the next day, they're going to have the big opening ceremony of the land and of the place. And she spends that night in the house of one of the settlers who works for the logger. And so nobody trusts him. But she says, everybody has a spark of goodness in them somewhere. And I'm sure I can persuade him to come and join us in our sustainable project. And that night, it's raining very hard, and the gunmen go out to try and kill her in the house where she is staying. It's a setup, right? But they can't see because it's so dark. They can't see through the walls. The walls are just made of trees, little narrow tree, like sort of bamboo. So unbeknownst to her, they're going around and they're trying to kill her, but they can't do it. And the next morning, the sun is shining, and it's a lovely day, and she's excited, and she gets up early, and she takes her bag with the papers, and she always carries a Bible with her, and she sets off, and she goes along the path in the forest, and she meets 2 gunmen, and they pull a gun on her. And she says, don't do this. We can give you land. You can have land of your own. You don't have to work for the logger. You can live happily in the land. And she has a big old cloth bag with her, which has a map of the land, and she takes it and she puts it on the ground and she shows them, and she said, here's the land, and you can have some for yourselves, this is for everybody. And the gunman, she puts the map bag back in her bag. And the gunman says, "What are you doing? Have you got an arm? Do you have a gun in there?" And she pulls out her Bible and she said, "That's my only arm that I have." And she reads, the guy's pointing a gun at her, and she reads the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the poor in heart, for they shall see God." And then the guy shoots her 6 times, and she falls. And one of the people who is late to the party has come up and seen this, and he's standing behind a tree, and he sees it, and he sees when Dorothy falls to the ground. And he runs back and tells everybody, "They've killed Dorothy, they've killed Dorothy," and everybody's terrified that they're going to kill them as well. And the word gets out, and it goes around the world that they've killed Dorothy. And there's an enormous international fuss about it. And what happened was that for the first time in any of these assassinations, the case was brought to court within 1 year, and the gunmen were jailed. And then over the course of years, they got the guy who paid the gunman and the guy who paid the guy who paid the gunman, and they worked their way up to a certain level, but they never got the people at the top, and they never will.
Amazing story, highly relevant for today.
Yes.
So the story of Dorothy Stang became your book, The Greatest
Yes.
Gift,
Yes.
which maybe will soon be a movie.
Yes.
So for those of you who make movies, take note. Let's bring it forward to now.
Right.
The violence in the Amazon against indigenous people, against activists, is both physical
Yep.
and increasingly economic.
Yes.
In Ecuador, the government is actively closing bank accounts for any NGO that works for the forest. And they're even making it such that you cannot donate toward NGO projects to protect the forest without it going through the government. In Brazil, there are many problems with illegal mining and illegal logging and indigenous people being killed.
Right.
Their stories are not being told, but it's happening every day,
Yes.
all across the Amazon. You mentioned organized crime. You
Yes.
mentioned some of these things. How has it evolved since 2006? When was she killed?
Yeah, 2005.
She was killed in
Yes,
2005.
20 years ago. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the 20th anniversary of
Yes.
her death.
Yes.
And when did you write the book?
The following year it was published.
You wrote it right away then?
Yes, right away. Right
Wow.
away.
So your book will be 20 years old next year.
Absolutely.
20 years on,
Yes.
what does this situation and topic look like today?
Well, Stan, when leaders fall, people are scared, and everything stops for a little while. And then you can see if the leader really was a leader, if in time that seed that he or she planted sprouts, right? And now, since then, the violence continues, accelerated. And it's accelerated by all kinds of things. There's the rush for rare earth, there's the cocaine, there's the organized crime, there's arms, money laundering. You know, the Amazon is just a hotbed of different kinds of crime, but they're all basically connected with extractivism. And so the two sides are the sides that want to take everything that there is from the Amazon and use it for themselves and for their friends, and the others who want to protect the Amazon and make sure that the people who live here can live better. And so, rather to my surprise, I haven't been to Belém for about 5 years, but the Dorothy Stang movement and all the other people who have died since, and about 20 activists die every year that we know of, and lots that we don't. The movement is solid. There's a sort of growing civil society in Brazil has had its ups and downs, but at the moment it's in fairly good shape. And I think that there's a growing interest, and Brazil is, as a nation, is realizing at the last minute that the Amazon is a treasure trove, and it's for everybody. It's not just for the people who want to practice extractivism. So I think one of the things that this COP should be about should be, how do we protect this resource that is for everybody, not just in Brazil, not just in the Amazon, but across the world? And how do we protect the defenders of the forest, right?
For sure. And how do we do that?
The state is relatively absent. It's a very large, lawless area. Think Wild West, right? We do that through education, basically, educating the people about their rights and then encouraging them to work together to make sure this happens. By lobbying governments, that's what's going on here now as we speak. It's going to take time, and the Amazon doesn't have time. So that's why whatever happens here these couple of weeks is critically important.
Yes, I mean, the Brazilian government just announced the Tropical Forest Fund Forever, the Forever Fund.
Yes.
Most people I've spoken to think that this is one of the best efforts we've seen so far and deserves support. But how do you see this work happening in the local environs of the Amazon, within the local communities? Who are the people or the organizations that deserve support and that need to be amplified?
I think part of the whole climate financing story that's going on at the moment is that for the first time in COPs, they've included local communities and indigenous groups. And that is, a mandated activity of COP. And I think if we can ensure that a percentage of that money goes to those people, that is the way to do it.
Yeah, that's a very big number that they're talking about under Article 6 of 1.3 trillion, which they have not figured out how to activate or move yet.
Right.
So, that's an issue. But certainly, I would suppose it's Brazil is the fulcrum to be able to, potentially get that. But there are international pathways for capital. That actually brings us onto this other issue around economic violence against activists and NGOs. What are you seeing in that space now, and what are you hearing about?
It's always been dangerous in Brazil to be an activist, and not just in the Amazon, all across the country, right? And the economic violence is the way in which the governments will not release money, will not fund them, and keep the money for themselves, or keep talking about it and it never even comes. So it's absolutely crucial that we can figure out a way between us that this money can get to the places on the front line, because these are the people that are doing the work, right?
Yeah. And who are some of the organizations that you see doing that work today, carrying on the legacy of Dorothy?
The Catholic Church is absolutely paramount in the question of human rights. That's very important. Lots of environmental organizations, both at local level and at international level. Academia. Groups, just small groups of people in scattered places. There's a lot of different ways and different actors working in this space. Right?
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because here at the Hub, we have been talking a lot about the theme of our Hub, which is Dream New Dreams, and the idea that technology and the work that we are doing can result in a better future. Yeah. What would you think, based on your research of Dorothy and the work that you've done to tell her story, if she were here at COP today, what do you think she would be saying?
She would be saying, Stan, this is the last minute before midnight. She would be saying, we've got to pull together, and we can. And I think she would put her faith in the local people, and particularly in the new generation. Because the older generation now came and fought these wars, heroically held the line, but now it's time to move into the next stage. And I think you will find indigenous people are getting educated and are becoming activists in their own right. The first book I wrote in the 1990s, I met a cacique called Almir Surui. He was telling me, he was 30 years old in Rondônia, he was telling me about the first time that his people came in touch with a white man and how there was violence, and how his father, who was the chief, sent him to live with the Funai, with the Indian agency man, and learn Portuguese. And when I met him, he could speak Portuguese, and he was telling me he had just become a chief. He was 30 years old. 15 years later, I met him at a climate reality session with Al Gore, and there he was with his laptop, and his land had become a red project. 2 years ago, his daughter, who is a lawyer, spoke at the opening plenary of the Biodiversity COP. So, there's a new generation of activists who are educated and who have the resources and who are able to tap into international resources through tech. And I think that's the way to go, and I think Dorothy would be with it every step of the way.
Fantastic. The Murder of Dorothy Stang, the story of Dorothy Stang, and the legacy of Dorothy Stang. Thank you for taking the time and the effort and doing the work to make sure that she is remembered. The greatest gift available wherever you find a book, and maybe soon as a movie.
Yes. It's a movie that it's a story that needs to be told.
For sure. Thank you, Binka, for joining us. I hope that you have a very productive and wonderful rest of your COP. For the Hub Culture Chronicles, I'm Stan Stolniker. Thank you for listening to this story. Wherever you find your podcasts, you can find more conversations from the Chronicles and more content coming from here in Belém at the mouth of the Amazon.